Now, just a little warning before we begin, there will be major spoilers in this video for the 5th episode of Andor, so if you haven't seen it yet and you don't want anything ruined, it is a really good time to click away. Okay, so for the second week in a row, we get an episode that is completely devoid of any and all action, which I know is going to be a big complaint from some people, that the series is too slow-paced, that not enough is happening, that this is Star Wars, it's supposed to be action-oriented, we're supposed to have lightsaber battles and space battles and all these things. And though I won't necessarily disagree with that assessment, as I've said before, I get people who go to Star Wars for fun adventure. I have to say this is a refreshing change of pace. It's refreshing to see something completely character-driven, or should I say something well-written that is completely character-driven, because without good writing, a character-driven story is pretty much irrelevant. A good action movie can have bad writing and still be enjoyed for its action, but a poor character study with poorly written characters is, of course, just never going to be entertaining. That said, I really enjoyed the theme of this episode, which goes along with the name of the episode, which was The Axe Forgets, basically meaning that an axe can chop down 1,000 or 10,000 trees. One axe can do this, and it's going to more or less forget each individual tree. However, for each individual tree, they are going to remember that one axe, and before you know it, you have thousands of trees. You have a forest, essentially, that all remembers this one axe. And so what this episode is showing us is that the Empire itself is forgetting all these little things that they are doing to the individual people of the galaxy, but for these individuals, it is everything to them. They remember that day that the Empire came in and destroyed their life like it was yesterday, and it really reminds me of one of my favorite lines in movies ever, which actually comes from the movie Street Fighter, when Chun-Li is talking about how the day came when M. Bison came to her village and killed her father and did all these horrible things. And he responds, basically, for me, that was a Tuesday. I don't even remember your village because I have done all of these horrible things. And yet here you are, your life has been defined by that one moment I have forgotten, which is exactly what this episode is kind of all about. And though I don't usually kind of get into the nuts and bolts of an individual episode when I do reviews, I kind of give a general overview and maybe some things I like, some things I didn't like. In this case, because I have really been enjoying Andor, I like just kind of all the intrigue and just the tension and everything it's building. I'm going to try something a little different. I'm going to just kind of go through the episode and talk about some of the scenes, not all of them, but pretty much all the scenes and how they kind of relate to each other and how they relate to this theme. And what we open this episode with is Cyril Karn kind of looking out the window and kind of contemplating his life, right? And it's interesting because he's kind of teary-eyed and kind of upset, which you can understand. He's just lost his job and now he has to go home with see his mother, who is very overbearing, and kind of the mother who is always trying to figure out what her son should be doing with his life, is trying to, control his life, even though the best thing for a parent to do is let their children go eventually and make their own mistakes and make their own way, for better or worse. And I love at the end of this scene, not to get too far ahead of myself, how the mother kind of pushes more food at her son. It's a nice little touch and just shows how this mother really just, kind of micromanages her son, thinks she knows everything that is best for him. Really love that little moment. That said, what I find kind of fascinating about this character, other than he's eating cereal and his name is like Cyril, and now I think Fruity Pebbles is canon in Star Wars, but whatever. What I find fascinating about this character is he's kind of presented as the villain. He's one of our villains. I think he's obviously going to turn into a pretty big villain down the road here, as he's kind of obsessed with finding Cassian, who he blames for ruining his life. That said, he's done nothing wrong. What he tried to do was to find a murderer. I mean, Cassian, he got jumped by these local security cops, essentially, and accidentally killed one and then, murdered the other in cold blood to kind of cover his tracks. And what Cyril was trying to do is just find the guy who killed 2 security officers. Next, we're on Aldhani, and we see Cassian wake up, and he finds that Skeen is going through all his stuff, and he's just trying to figure out who Cassian is, and this is apparently at the order of Vel. None of them really trust Cassian, which, that makes sense. One of my biggest problems is it's kind of redundant at this point. We kind of got a lot of that in the first episode. This episode goes into it much more, but at least in this episode, we kind of learn more about these characters, who they are, where they're coming from, and why they maybe mistrust Cassian, because they all have their own motives where they don't know what his is. Like, why are you here fighting when I personally know why I'm fighting the Empire, or why he or she is fighting the Empire? What is it that's motivating you, and can I trust you? Is your motivation basically good enough to be trusted? We then move on to Coruscant with Mon Mothma and again see her husband, and we see that she has a teenage daughter. And this had to be probably the most real and grounded Earth-like scene I've ever seen in Star Wars, which not a bad thing, mind you, but Here is this woman, a professional woman who has, a lot on her plate professionally, and she's dealing with problems with her husband, some sort of marital problems. She also has a rather rebellious teenage daughter who seems to favor her father, who's probably the more lenient of the two, I'm guessing. And so here you have this woman who has this career, who is a senator in the Republic, of course, or excuse me, the Empire. And, she's just having a bad morning with her family. The daughter then sums it all up by basically saying it's always about you. And of course, I'm sure she has to sit back and think at this point how much not only is she sacrificing in terms of risking her life to kind of fight the Empire underground here and start a rebellion, but she's kind of losing her family too. Now, we have no idea what is the exact deal with her and her husband, what has led them kind of to be, estranged here even, you could say. I'm going to assume that her husband, he talked about being in the military or having, a military buddy in the previous episode, that he is kind of more for the Empire and that is starting to split them apart. Next up, we had another scene that I really, really enjoyed that started between Nemik and Cassian, where he's kind of prodding Cassian, trying to figure out who he is and why he's here. And Nemik is, of course, a very young and idealistic person. He wants to figure out the troubles of the galaxy and to fix them. And he thinks he kind of has it all figured out, hence he's writing his manifesto. And I think this nails a lot of young people really well. No offense to young people out there, but a lot of the time you have a more simplistic view of the galaxy where you kind of see it, as it should be. And you're like, well, why isn't it that way? Why can't we just fix it and make it better? And then, of course, you have Skeen come in and says one of my favorite lines of the entire series so far, that he sees oppression everywhere, speaking to Nemik. He also then says, Skeen also says to Nemik that the only thing keeping us from liberty is a few more ideas, saying this to him in a very kind of mocking way, pointing out that the more rules and laws you have to make, the more freedom you actually have. And this comes from someone with the more wisdom perspective, someone who's older and been there and done that. Again, Nemik is kind of the young idealist who thinks he can fix the world, but a lot of times when you try to fix things, you just make them worse for people. Anyway, not to get too deep into that discussion, we then learn why Cassian is actually needed on this mission, and that's because the ship is going to be on a rail track and they need a certain amount of momentum to get out of the hangar or whatever the case may be. And for whatever reason, they think Cassian is going to know all this, which he does. He seems to know how to get his ship out of this hangar or whatever it's going to be, and then he wants to fly it, which they eventually do agree to let him be the one to fly the ship. Next up, then, we're taken to Ferrix, and we see the Empire is completely taken over. We see the ISB officer Blevin, and he is talking to a captain who is kind of being put in charge of the planet. And this captain wants to be called Prefect, not because it's a pay raise or anything, but because he wants the title, he wants the prestige of it all, which again is kind of just showing the contrast between the Rebellion and the Empire. The Rebellion, they have a purpose. They want something, important for not just themselves, but for the galaxy. Whereas here you have a kind of a petty Imperial officer who just wants a title for the sake of it to make himself feel more important. He's not actually fighting for anything other than, again, kind of the prestige of being known as something or somebody. We then go back to Aldhani, where we see that Cassian and some of the others are trying to learn how to march so that they can fit in at the base and look like actual soldiers. No one will think the wiser of them being there. And Cassian is able to kind of give some tips and advice. He can spot, what handed people are. And this is the first time I think they realize, or at least Vel kind of realizes, that maybe he can be more than just kind of the mercenary we've hired to, help us on this mission, that he has some valuable insight. And it's kind of a mini turning point, I think, for some of them, or at least for Vel, that she can see that, yes, we are paying him. And at this point, she's the only one who knows that. But he can have value. He obviously is not just some random guy that they've hired to fly a ship. We then get another really cool scene, I think, at the base with Lieutenant Gorn, who's the one helping the rebels steal the Imperial payroll. He's, a traitor, essentially. And it's this kind of cool slice of life moment, actually, or scene, kind of going along with that Mon Mothma one earlier, where we learn that these, Imperial troopers, essentially, whatever they are technically, they're interested in seeing the lights show the next night, the eye opening up, and this kind of cosmic event, that they have little wants and desires and personalities of their own. Oftentimes, the bad guys are just put into quote-unquote stormtrooper suits and are mindless, faceless, enemies. Here you just get this little taste of that they have lives of their own, little wants and desires, and that they are actual people. But of course, that's not the only point of the scene. It's not even close. It actually sets up why there will be less people on duty the next night when they are going to try to steal those Imperial credits. Because again, a lot of these troopers, or whatever they are, mechanics, the day-to-day people at the base, they want to see the cosmic event of the eye opening up and the light show. And so the lieutenant is doing them a favor and going to allow them to postpone some duty to the next night. And they're going to have minimal people downstairs, which kind of, makes it look less suspicious that if he would just on a random night try to post less people, that it would immediately probably out him. And so he has a nice little excuse or a way out of being immediately blamed for being part of this eventual heist. Next up, we get our one and only scene with Dedra in this episode, the ISB officer who is starting to kind of put together that a rebellion may be forming. And she walks past Blevin at the start of the scene, who seems to have a small little team of officers at his disposal, where she only has one. Though again, he has like 6 systems, I think we learned in the previous episode, where she has 2. So it does make sense that she would have a smaller staff. Nevertheless, it is just her and this one other officer, and she's kind of apologizing to him, saying, hey, go home, it's late. But this officer is like, nah, let's keep doing this. Let's find these rebels. Let's put the clues together. And then something interesting happens. She takes some kind of pill of some kind. I don't know if it could be something as simple as she has a headache or it's some kind of stimulant. This could play into her character later. She could have some sort of addiction, because usually you don't show something in a movie or show unless it will have bearing later or down the road. Next up, we then learn from Val why Lieutenant Gorn is in this, why he is joining the rebellion or betraying the Empire, and that is because he fell in love with a local woman. He lost his promotion over this, and then he lost her, and so he has kind of fallen out of love with the Empire, and now he's helping them. And she even says, another really great line in this episode, that everyone has their own rebellion. Again, going along with that theme of, the axe chops down one tree and goes on to the next and forgets, but that one tree always remembers the axe. And so you have all these different people who have their own reasons, and eventually you're going to have a rebellion full of people who have their own reasons, versus the Empire, who is, filled with the captains from before who are just looking for prestige. They're not in it for any sort of real cause other than to promote themselves. Next up, in what turns out to be sort of the defining moment or the turning point for this little ragtag rebellion, what will kind of start to bring them together for real now. And again, they have kind of overplayed the mistrust thing, but it does get a resolution here. And that happens when Skeen holds a knife to Andor's throat, takes the necklace from him, the Sky Kyber crystal, and demands to know why he has this 30,000 credit necklace that he's taking to a robbery. Andor eventually comes clean, tells him he is being paid to be here. He is not a for the cause guy like the rest of them. He doesn't have his own rebellion story. And that now they can no longer use him as an excuse to back out of the mission at the last minute here, because they now know what he's here for. There's no reason to not trust him. He's going to be paid if it succeeds. So of course he has motivation to succeed, even if that motivation is not the same as their own, which is more personal. This is when we get yet another really good line, this time from Cassian, who admits he's afraid, but then says there's a difference between fear and losing your nerve. Essentially, yes, of course, they all are afraid. They all could die tomorrow in this mission, and that you have to either accept that and face that and get it done, or you have to give in to your fear and back out. And again, now that Cassian has been up front, he's told them why he's there, they no longer can use him as an excuse to say, well, we can't trust him, so we can't go ahead with this mission. Skeen will then later on tell Cassian about what happened to his brother, that he had a farm and that the Empire came and basically flooded his farm for some reason, and then his brother took his own life. And so that's why he fights, and he doesn't even know what he has become anymore because of all this hatred he has for the Empire. Again, going back to the whole axe chopping down a tree. The axe forgets this one act against this guy, but the tree remembers and will form a forest rebellion, for lack of a better way of putting it. We also do sort of see it the other way, though. We see Cyril, who I think pretty definitely will eventually be a member of the Empire, a full-fledged member, probably will encounter Dedra at some point and work with her. We see him looking at this image of Andor, this holographic image of Andor, the guy who has kind of destroyed his life. So it's not that nobody in the Empire has motivations for being there or for doing what they're doing. It's just an interesting kind of contrast that what is motivating Cyril is just pure revenge for his own sake. A lot of these other stories we heard in this episode have to do with families or someone they loved being wronged by the Empire, something they loved being destroyed by the Empire. And here it's Cyril probably going to the Empire because of something somebody took from him personally. Again, just a nice little contrast that I really like and have really been enjoying about this series so far. We then get this really beautiful shot of Coruscant, gave a lot of prequel vibes. Maybe it was the prettiest shot in the whole series so far, to be honest. We then pan down to Mon Mothma and her husband in a luxury speeder on their way home from some sort of function or event. And we again see how they're sort of having marital problems. He mentions to her that she was talking about this new foundation all night and he didn't know why it was so important to her. And she basically said the reason she didn't bring it up to him is because it's charitable, basically saying to him that you don't really care about these sort of things. You are just in it for yourself. Again, just showing the rift between these two, which is going to lead to who knows where. I'm going to assume at some point the husband is going to put it together what Mon Mothma is really doing, and that is going to lead to some interesting decisions, especially with a child now in the mix that we have never known about. We never knew that Mon Mothma had a teenage daughter at this time period. Finally, then, we get our one and only glimpse at Luthen Rael in this episode, and we again have trouble figuring out just who this guy is exactly, because part of him seems to be very worried about the team because he's trying to get some sort of word from them just before the mission goes forward. And yet part of him just seems like he's only worried about himself. He's worried about that Vel can essentially lead back to him, and that Andor can as well. So it's again this guy who has his own motivations, which I'm hoping we find out sooner or later. And it's hard to tell just how much he cares about whatever his motivation is, how much he cares for the cause, and how much he cares for the other people involved. All in all, another really good episode in my opinion, if not a bit slow and a bit redundant with the whole trusting thing, but at least it does come to fruition. At least we get a resolution out of it. We get to understand why they are so mistrusting, because they are looking for a way out. They are afraid. They are about to start something much, much bigger potentially, which is also what Luthen says at the end of the episode, that it's either about to finish or something is about to start. And again, I'm just enjoying getting to see how the individual characters will eventually create something much, much bigger, how the actions of one or the actions of the Empire inspire the actions of others to rise up against them and to form something that will eventually defeat them. Yes, we're still early, but you can tell, you can feel that we're building each week to something much bigger. And eventually, I think we're going to get plenty of action. Eventually, I think the story is going to get huge and it's going to have a lot more intrigue. I don't know. So far, very much enjoying it. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. So take to the comments below. Tell me what you thought of this week's episode of Andor, or what you thought of this review. Would you like more reviews like this, or do you prefer my other style that is kind of more an overview? Whatever the case may be, leave your comments below. Let's talk some Star Wars, and until next time, thanks for watching.